Good morning or good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in and when you're watching it. I know Newcastle alumni are all around the world, so very pleased to be talking with you today. I'm Mark Shucksmith. I did an MSc back in the 1970s and then a PhD at Newcastle, and I've been on the staff here for the last 15 or so years. And I'm going to talk to you today about rural poverty in Britain. That's a subject that I've been researching more than any other one. And people are often very surprised to find that anybody's interested in researching rural poverty, because in Britain, most people think about poverty being an urban phenomenon. They say poverty means urban, doesn't it? And they conjure up pictures like the ones in these slides. And rural areas, I mean, most of the pictures you tend to see of rural areas on the TV don't even have people in at all. They're just beautiful landscapes. They're picturesque, they're idyllic. How could it possibly contain poverty? Well, I'm going to try and show you today something about the reality of rural life. And we'll begin with this diagram, which shows the trends in poverty rates in rural and urban parts of Britain from 1991 up until the latest figures, 2017. And you can see the solid black line shows urban poverty, the dotted one shows rural poverty. And the most surprising thing for most people is that there's very little difference between them. Urban poverty is slightly higher usually. It certainly was during the period up until the Labour government came in 1997. And then poverty in both urban and rural areas followed a very similar path, about the same level, and both went down during the Labour years. And then with the economic crisis, there was a bit of a jump, as you can see, in both urban and rural areas. And after that, poverty stayed at a pretty similar level. Urban poverty, though, was higher than rural poverty, and both are now increasing again. Now, in my own research, I've looked at the British Household Panel Survey, which follows the same households every year. And so you can see people moving in and out of poverty. You can try and understand what are the factors leading to their poverty or their escape from poverty. And one of the most interesting things is that you can see whether people have ever been in poverty during that period. And during that period, 1991, up until the financial crisis in 2008, half of the households in rural Britain experienced at least one spell of poverty, 50.2%. And that's only a little bit lower than the 55.2% in urban Britain who experienced at least one spell of poverty during that period. So the main point from that research is that rural poverty is not a minority experience, and it touches almost as many families in rural Britain as it does in urban Britain, despite all of our preconceptions about that. As I say, the risk of poverty diminished a bit after Labour came to power, and by more in rural than in urban, but poverty rates are growing again now in both rural and urban areas. Interestingly, the Financial Conduct Authority more recently in 2018 did a survey of financial hardship and financial vulnerability. And they were very surprised to discover that 55% of rural households in 2018 exhibit financial vulnerability in terms of maybe having missed a bill payment or being behind with their rent or some other indicator like that. So why are people poor in rural Britain? And I've done a lot of different research projects to try and answer that. And I'll just try and summarize some of the main conclusions that we've drawn from that evidence very briefly, very succinctly. Firstly, there is more persistent low pay in rural areas than there is in urban. Low pay is characteristic of many of the jobs that there are in rural areas. That's not to say that all rural households have low pay, because many rural households commute to cities where they perhaps have more professional managerial jobs. But in rural Britain, there's more poverty in work even than there is in urban Britain. There's a higher cost of living at the same time. Studies by the people who calculate what the living wage should be and the minimum income standard, they've done research which looks at rural households, and they found that the cost of living is higher and that you need a substantially higher income in rural areas in order to meet the cost of all those essentials which form the basis for them calculating what the living wage should be. And the main factors which are different, the main things which add to the costs are there's a much greater cost of fuel, meaning more households are in fuel poverty. And that's because many more households are off-grid. They can't get mains gas, which is the cheapest form of fuel, so they have to rely on electricity or oil or propane. Often the houses are older and are not well insulated as well. And the other aspect of fuel costs is transport. People in rural areas have to have a car. Public transport is very lacking, very irregular, just doesn't take you to your work or to your essential services. So people in rural areas almost always regard a car as an essential. Another element of rural life is the lack of affordable rural housing. Lots and lots of people in Britain want to live in rural areas, and yet we have planning policies which try and prevent houses being built in the countryside. So obviously the laws of demand and supply mean that housing is more expensive. I think we're about the only country in the world where rural housing costs are higher than urban housing costs on average. A very strange situation. So that has an impact as well on who can afford to live in the countryside, and of the people who do, it means that they have less of their income disposable for other living costs. Another aspect of rural life is the digital exclusion, which is a bigger problem in rural areas. There is less mobile signal, there's less high-speed broadband, so more and more houses in rural areas lack these essential ways of connecting, which are more and more important as services are increasingly centralized and digitalized. You can imagine during the pandemic, during the lockdowns, the difficulties that pupils in many rural areas had in going online for their education, and the disadvantage that was intensified for those households as a result. Similarly, households who wanted to claim the support that was available for the government during lockdown through welfare benefits and other sources had to be able to get online in order to do that, in order to apply for jobs, in order to register, in order to provide the record of job applications and so on, which are required for you not to be sanctioned and to lose your benefits. Not surprisingly, when you look at welfare benefits, there were lower claimant rates in rural areas, and there have been for many years, even before they went digital. And that seems to reflect partly a stigma attached in small communities to receiving benefit. The distance from centres where you might get advice and support, showing you how to register, how to apply, thinking of citizens' advice and debt services and so on. And also the fact that people who are poor tend to be scattered, whereas in urban contexts, they tend to be in social housing where their landlords and their neighbours will give them advice and make them aware of benefits they might be entitled to. So there's a real challenge for the state or for the voluntary and community sector to reach into rural areas to help people, to provide them with support and advice, and to help them in all sorts of ways, with education, with health services and so on. But it's also the case that there are inappropriate policies that have been developed for urban contexts by people who are probably based in London and who are unaware of what it's like to live in a rural area, unaware that you may not be able to find a bus to the nearest job centre, unaware of how difficult it may be to apply for work or to get to a library or any of the other things. So we've done some recent research on this, which I'll just sort of summarize very briefly now. I've already told you a lot about it, but if you want to read more about it, you can read about it on our website, rurallives.co.uk. Our Rural Lives project looked not at big surveys, but it was looking at individual households, going and talking to people in 3 different study areas in rural Britain. We wanted to know what had changed in people's experiences of rural life since the financial crisis of 2007-2008. We found there'd been big changes, both in labour markets and housing markets. And these have produced social changes with uneven impacts. In terms of labour markets, There was more low pay. There were more insecure jobs, more 0 hours contracts, more people having to stitch together a living by doing 2 or 3 different part-time jobs. A widening inequality between people in those circumstances and those who had professional, secure jobs with good pensions. And the housing market changes had often meant that children could no longer, when they were trying to form their own households, live anywhere near their parents because of the unaffordability of rural housing. They had to move away, both often to find better jobs, but also because it was impossible for them to find housing nearby. And that meant that family support networks were stretched at a distance, something which was a particular issue during lockdown when families were a long distance apart and couldn't travel to see each other or help each other. The state's role had also changed since the financial crisis. You can think of the state as an enabler, building people's capacity to act collectively or individually, as a regulator, regulating land use. We've spoken about planning already, but particularly in this context as a provider of public services, of pensions, of welfare benefits, education, healthcare, and so on. And that role had been diminished by the austerity cutbacks, particularly the cutbacks to local government, which the National Audit Office have been warning about how severe the consequences of those are for people in need. Welfare reform has added to insecurity and hardship with specific rural dimensions, which I could talk about at length, but I don't have time to go into today, but you'll find them in our report there. The voluntary community sector, as I've said, have often taken on new social roles to try and fill some of the gaps and face this rising demand and the need, but with minimal funding. Often themselves they were getting funding from local government, which is now less forthcoming. And of course their volunteers were often aging, which was great. You know, people in retirement wanting to put something back, still very active. But during the pandemic, again, a lot of these people had to shield, had to isolate because they were at greater risk. The other main source of support in rural communities is the role of informal networks of friends, neighbours and family, often thought to be of greater importance in rural communities. And indeed, we did find in many communities there was a lot of this type of support. There was a lot of kindness, a lot of material support, a lot of information as well. But at the same time, there was a negative side to it. I spoke already about the stigma attached to receiving welfare payments in normal times, and indeed the stigma attached to transgressing any of the social norms which are there in the community. You wouldn't want to be seen to be going to a food bank, for example. And if you had done something wrong, or if you'd recently moved in and hadn't formed those sorts of networks yet, then you were probably less able to get that sort of help. So rural lives are changing in the context of austerity after the financial crash. They're changing again under the impact of the pandemic, and I've in passing touched on some of the ways in which that's happening. But I haven't got a lot of time. I'm just giving you a brief talk today, so let me just sort of summarize some of the main conclusions here now. Poverty declined in both rural and urban Britain after 1999, but it's now increasing again. And as I said, rural poverty is not a minority experience. It's not only an urban experience. Half the people in rural Britain experienced at least one spell of poverty between 1991 and 2008. And that's not very different to the level amongst the urban population. So that explodes a common myth, a common misconception that poverty is primarily urban. We can see the impacts in rural areas, as I've said, of these structural processes of change, notably of the flexibilization of labour markets, 0 hours contracts, insecure self-employment and all this sort of thing. Of the changes in economies, the move from what might have been once mainly agricultural and manufacturing is now very much a service economy in rural areas as it is in urban areas. Neoliberalization, the withdrawal of the state, the imposition in its place of all sorts of new rules and sanctions and targets and ways of doing things which are different. Welfare conditionality is an example of that. And overall, you see an individualization of social risk and a rescaling of social risk from the solidarity of the nation state down to it being up to the individual and up to the local community to try and help themselves. The need for rural proofing of policies is apparent, I think, from everything I've been saying, and especially of DWP's welfare system, which may work well in urban areas, but is fundamentally challenged by the volatile and uneven incomes that you get in the rural labour markets, and the difficulties of being asked to go to job centres to have regular meetings when there isn't public transport there, and so on and so forth. I'll just give you one example I should have maybe touched on earlier, but it does illustrate this. One of our study areas was in the Western Isles of Scotland. And if you're unable to work for physical or mental illness reasons, you have to go to a work capability assessment centre to be assessed. The DWP won't accept your doctor's assessment of you. You have to go to an outsourced agency. Their nearest offices to the Western Isles are in Inverness or Portree in Skye. So you've got to get a ferry or an aeroplane. And unfortunately, it seems the word on the ground is that if you travel to one of those places, then you'll fail the assessment. You'll be deemed fit for work because you've been fit for travel. On the other hand, if you say you can't travel, then you can be waiting a year or even 2 years for the one day a year when the service comes to the island. So it's very disadvantaging, but that probably wouldn't occur to somebody in Whitehall. Voluntary and community organisations play a vital role, as I've said. They're perceived by everybody as the first port of call, but they face challenges their own in terms of resourcing and volunteer numbers. But to finish on an optimistic note, there is emergent agency at local level. There are people who want to do things and are doing things together, providing food parcels, organising to try and create new jobs which are more secure. And this could be supported better by government. The Scottish government are probably supporting it better than the English government. And in addition to that, this broader set of policy challenges that I've identified as I've gone through. I hope that's informative. It may be very different if you're in another country in the world, but this is what rural life in Britain today is like for those who are financially vulnerable. Thank you very much.